Welcome to Civic Currents, where we explore the inner workings of American democracy. We're your hosts, Seth Becker.
And I'm Caleb Steckman. In today's premiere episode, we're diving into the origins and evolution of one of the most controversial procedures in the U.S. Senate, the filibuster. It wasn't written into the Constitution, and yet it shapes major legislation to this day. How did this come to be? Let's find out. Okay, so obviously, the first episode, we talk about the origins and evolutions of the filibuster. And one point I just wanted to bring up at the start was there's actually no mention of the filibuster or any sort of like legislation to hold or halt is mentioned in the Constitution. So basically, yeah, the U.S. Constitution says nothing about unlimited debate, and the founders did not intend for factions to halt legislation indefinitely.
So filibusters were created by mistake.
Yeah, basically. Um, so, what do you like? What do you think of it? Like? What's your take on that? What do you feel about the founders like not having any intentions for that at all?
Then I don't understand why it's still around and still deciding deep legislation. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have to like agree with that. Like, I don't. Yeah, I guess if the founders didn't want it to be a thing,
like
then
the Senate, unlike the House, prides itself on being a deliberative body. But the original intent was to operate under a majority rule. Filibusters were rare, but they're not meant to obstruct the legislation routinely, at least like not like it is now.
yeah, I mean, I just think like if the founding fathers did not intend for the filibuster to exist in the Constitution, then why is it something that we use so much today, especially um, in the modern era of voting and legislation? It's used so much to basically turn around big political events that could have gone a different way had the filibuster not existed. So, the other point that's also interesting about this is that in 1806, there was actually a rule change um, suggesting that the okay, so as I was saying, back in 1806, the Vice President Aaron Burr, yes, that Aaron Burr, argued that the Senate had too many rules. So basically, he suggested that we drop the previous question motion, which was the mechanism to end debate and bring a matter to a vote.
And the Senate agreed. They figured, sure, why not simplify things? But in doing so, they removed their only tool for cutting off debate. What they didn't realize was that they just created the conditions for the filibuster.
So, also, we have a quote to talk about basically saying that the filibuster was created by mistake. So, what Burr saw as a cleanup turned out to be a loophole, and basically, that led any senator to keep talking endlessly and delay or block action.
Here's the thing though, like even after that rule change, senators did not start using the filibuster right away. It wasn't an immediate go to tactic, you know.
Right, right. And the first official filibuster didn't happen until 1837, where a group of Whig senators used long speeches to delay a bill they opposed. And that was actually very rare. Filibusters were still seen as extreme measures back then, so it really didn't get used that much.
And that's important. The Senate liked to think itself as the cooling saucer of legislation, more measured than the House. Debate was a virtue, not a roadblock. The Senate was intended to slow things down, but not stop them altogether.
So there's actually a big difference between debate and indefinite debate. The Senate originally ran on a majority rule, and this idea of the minority holding the floor indefinitely, that was never really part of the plan.
You know, what's wild is that the Constitution actually leaves room for each chamber to set its own rules. Article 1, Section 5 says each House may determine the rules of its proceedings. So the House and Senate could evolve in totally different directions.
And they actually did. The House, with hundreds of members, became more structured and efficient, and time limits, tight debate, and more fast votes started to happen.
But the Senate, with just 100 members, even fewer back then, embraced the open debate. Fewer voices meant that they could afford more discussion, or they thought.
Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about what happened in 1917. So, President Woodrow Wilson was trying to pass legislation to arm merchant ships during World War One, and isolationist Senator filibustered the bill, and Wilson is livid.
He calls them a little group of willful men and pressures the Senate to change its rules. That leads to the birth of Rule XX, Rule 22, the cloture rule.
So the cloture rule allowed the Senate to end debate with a two-thirds vote, and today it's three-fifths or 60 out of 100 senators. But even then, it's was still a major step in the right direction. So another quote that we have from Wilson was the Senate of the United States is the only legislative body in the world that cannot act when its majority is ready for action.
So now, at least in theory, the Senate has a way to break the filibuster. But here's where things get interesting and a little sneaky.
So basically, over time, senators realized they didn't even have to actually speak to block a bill. They just had to threaten to filibuster, and that alone could be enough to stop bills in its tracks, which is pretty crazy to think about.
That's the birth of the silent filibuster, where nothing happens on the Senate floor, but behind the scenes, everything grinds to a halt.
And it's very different from the image that we all had in our heads of someone standing at the podium and talking for hours, refusing to stop talking. But yeah, I mean, not even having to speak at all and just threatening the filibuster.
Yeah. But those marathon speeches, they were once real. In fact, for most of the 19th century, filibustering meant physically holding the floor.
And it wasn't glamorous either. You wouldn't be able to sit, you couldn't eat, there were no bathroom breaks. It was just talking and stalling.
Now, let's not pretend this was always about high minded principle. One of the earliest and most powerful uses of the filibuster was to block civil rights legislation.
Right. So in 1891, Senate Republicans tried to pass the Lodge Bill, which basically meant that it would have protected African American voting rights, and Southern Democrats filibustered it until it died. So another quote that we have is the filibuster was increasingly used to block civil rights, a trend that would define its legacy well into the 20th century.
So we start to see a shift from rare procedural quirk to a weapon used to maintain the racial hierarchy of the post Civil War South.
And while that use intensified in the 20th century, it has its roots in the 1800s and in a Senate that didn't mean to create the filibuster but never got around to fixing it.
So just to recap, the filibuster isn't in the Constitution. It was born in 1806 when Aaron Burr convinced the Senate to simplify its rules. It stayed rare for decades, but slowly became a tool of obstruction, and it was formalized in 1917 with the cloture rule, though that didn't solve the problem.
Exactly. The filibuster may have started as an accident, but by the 20th century, it had become a defining and decisive part of the Senate's identity.
After the break, we'll look at how the filibuster became even more powerful during the civil rights era and how it shapes some of the biggest legislative fights in American history.
This is the filibuster, power, politics, and procedure. I'm Caleb.
And I'm Seth. Stick around.
So, in the 19th century, filibusters were used sparingly. Senators knew they had to eventually come to a vote, and debate, yes, obstruction, rarely.
That's right. Back then, the Senate operated more on a mutual respect. Even when the debate got heated, there was a sense that action had to happen.
But eventually that began to shift, slowly at first, like erosion wearing down from a rock, then more noticeably as partisan divides deepen and the stakes of legislation grew higher.
So let's go back to the mid 1800s, where America was expanding, sectional tensions were rising, and slavery was becoming an unavoidable issue in national politics. This is where we start to see the filibuster used for more than just a delay. Now it's about blocking moral and political progress.
And one of the clearest examples comes from 1841. That's when the Whigs, who had just taken control of the Senate, proposed creating a national bank, and the Democrats did not like this idea at all.
So what did they do? They talked for weeks. Democrats filibustered the bill with long speeches and procedural tricks. They weren't trying to refine the legislation, they were trying to kill it outright.
And eventually, the Whigs gave in and dropped the bill. The message was clear: if you're in the minority and you really, really want to stop something, you just never stop talking.
Still, for most of the 19th century, this was the exception, not the rule. Filibusters weren't routine, they were rare and seen as extreme. And if you were going to do it, you had to physically hold the floor.
Fast forward to the 1850s and 1860s, and you'll find filibusters becoming more prominent in debates over slavery and civil rights. But even then, they were usually just limited to a handful of issues.
Exactly. And most legislation, especially less controversial stuff, still passed by majority vote. But once the Civil War ended, the dynamic began to shift again.
And during Reconstruction, Republicans in Congress tried to enforce these civil rights protections for the newly freed black Americans, but Southern Democrats used the filibuster to stop them with increasing frequency.
That's when the filibuster started being used as a deliberate tool to block civil rights, not just policy disagreements anymore. This was about preserving racial and political power. So we have a quote here that Southern senators wielded the filibuster like a sword, stopping civil rights enforcement bills dead in their tracks.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense. Let's take a look at one example: the Federal Elections Bill of 1890, also known as the Lodge Bill, which we mentioned earlier. This would have given the federal government power to supervise elections in the South to prevent voter suppression and fraud.
S- Southern Democrats filibustered it until it collapsed. And they didn't just stall, they used the time to paint it as a tyrannical overreach. Even though the bill aimed to protect the rights of black owners and never saw the light of day.
The takeaway: by the end of the 19th century, the filibuster was more than a tactic, it had become a defense mechanism, especially for the minority party when civil rights were on the line.
But here's the twist.
Even with this weapon, there was still no formal way to end debate. No cloture rule yet. Remember, that only came in 1917.
So, if someone was filibustering back then, there was really only one way to stop them, outlast them.
And that meant that a determined minority could derail almost any bill they wanted, even when a majority of senators and the country supported the legislation.
Let's pause for a second. What does this tell us? By the late 1800s, the filibuster had moved from a tool of last resort to a go to strategy, especially when it came to partisan gridlock and racial injustice.
And this shift set the tone for the 20th century, especially during the Civil Rights Movement, when the filibuster would be used again and again to block anti lynching bills, fair employment laws, and voting rights protections.
We'll explore that more in our next episode. But before we wrap this segment up, we want to zoom out and look at what was really changing.
It wasn't just the frequency of filibusters that increased, it was the purpose. What began as a tool for long, thoughtful speeches was now often about grinding the system into a halt.
And it worked. Over time, the cost of governing got higher. The rules didn't change, but the way senators used them absolutely did.
And as public policy grew more complex, and as America became more polarized, the filibuster became less about protecting minority opinions and more about making sure nothing happened unless there was an overwhelming consensus.
Which, let's be honest here, in today's political climate, that's a pretty tall order.
So, what started as an unintended procedural gap in 1806 became, by the earliest 20th century, a powerful tool of obstruction.
Used sparingly in the 1800s, weaponized by the early 1900s, and we haven't even reached the civil rights battles yet.
That's what we'll dive into next time, the filibuster's role in some of the most consequential fights in American history.
But for now, just remember, this wasn't supposed to happen. The filibuster wasn't part of the founder's vision. It wasn't built to stop civil rights. It wasn't meant to bring Congress to a standstill.
But it did, and it still does.
This has been the Filibuster Power, Politics, and Procedure. I'm Caleb.
And I'm Seth. Thanks for listening. See you in the next segment.
Welcome back to the Filibuster Power, Politics, and Procedure. I'm Caleb.
And I'm Seth. And today we're joined by a very special guest, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a Senate historian who spent decades researching the institution's rules, traditions, and legislative culture.
Dr. Carter, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Let's dive right in. In earlier segments, we talked about how the filibuster started more or less by accident, but didn't immediately get used the way we think of it today. Could you walk us through how it actually evolved in the 1800s? Sure. It wasn't until the late 19th and 20th centuries that we began to see the filibuster used more as a delaying tactic than as a tool of deep deliberation or debate. Early on, senators prided themselves on being thoughtful and measured, and debate was seen as part of that. But by the 1870s and the 1880s, especially around divisive issues like civil rights and federal power, the filibuster became a way to stall or kill bills, not just to add thoughtful input.
So you're saying it shifted from we need more time to discuss this to we don't want this bill to pass ever?
Exactly. Senators began using endless debates to prevent action entirely. It
It was especially effective because the Senate did not have a way to end debate back then. There is no cloture rule yet. So if someone filibustered, the only real option was to wait them out or give up.
What were some of the big examples during that time? I mean, we mentioned the Lodge Bill earlier in the episode. Does that fit?
Yes, the Federal Elections Bill of 1890, or Lodge Bill, is a perfect example. It would have increased federal oversight of elections to protecting voting rights, especially for black Americans in the South. Southern Democrats used the filibuster to block it, and they succeeded. That moment was a clear demonstration of how the filibuster could be used to undermine civil rights protections.
What was the first time the filibuster was used that way? To explicitly maintain social or racial power?
Not the first, but it was the most visible. And it marked a turning point. After that, we see the filibuster being used consistently to block civil rights legislation, including anti lynching bills, desegregation efforts, and voting protections all throughout the early 20th century.
And all that was happening before there was even a way to break a filibuster, right?
Yes, it wasn't until 1917 that the Senate introduced the Rule 22, to allow for cloture. That happened after a group of isolationist senators filibustered a bill to arm merchant ships during World War One. President Woodrow Wilson was furious. He called them a little group of willful men and pressured the Senate to create a rule to end debate supermajority vote.
And that was a two-thirds vote at the time, right?
Correct. Two-thirds of senators. That number wouldn't be lowered to three-fifths or 60 votes until 1975. But even in 1917, just having any mechanism to end debate was revolutionary.
Did that rule make the filibuster less powerful?
Not really. If anything, it formalized the filibuster. Before, it was just a long winded tactic. After cloture, it became a part of the official rules, which means Senator now had to plan legislation around the idea of reaching a supermajority. That's a huge shift in how Senate operated.
So, to recap, the filibuster goes from being a loophole in 1806 to a rare act of protest and then to a powerful tool for the minority by the early 1900s.
Exactly. And crucially, it became one of the most powerful when it's used to protect the status quo, to prevent change. Whether that's about race, labor laws, or war powers, the filibuster has often been used not to persuade or debate, but to stop progress in its tracks.
And that's actually such an important point. When people think of the filibuster today, they often picture that old school idea of Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington standing and talking for hours. But the reality has been for more strategic and, in many cases, far more damaging.
Yes, the romantic image doesn't match the historical reality. The filibuster has often been used not for noble dissent, but for entrenched resistance.
Dr. Carter, before we let you go, do you think this early history helps explain the current debates about reforming or even eliminating the filibuster?
Absolutely. If we understand that the filibuster was never part of the founder's plan and that it's evolved over time, then it becomes easier to see it as something that can and perhaps should evolve again. The Senate has changed its rules before, and it can do so again. It all depends on the will and the votes to do it.
Dr. Evelyn Carter, thank you so much for your insight and time today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And that was Dr. Evelyn Carter, Senate historian, helping us race the filibuster from rare speech to routine obstruction.
Coming up next, how the filibuster defined the civil rights era and the fights that finally forced reform decades later.
You're listening to The Filibuster, Power, Politics, and Procedure. Stick with us.
As time passed, the filibuster evolved from a rarity into a strategy. The term filibuster actually comes from the Dutch word Vibbuter, or pirate, an apt metaphor for its obstructive function. In the mid 20th century, we saw the emergence of the silent or procedural filibuster, where legislation could be blocked simply by the threat of debate. Without even speaking, senators could stall major bills indefinitely. What started as a loophole had become a cornerstone of legislative maneuvering.
What makes the filibuster so fascinating is that it's a symbol of both tradition and unintended consequence. It's not unconstitutional, but it's extra constitutional.
And the filibuster raises fundamental questions. Who really governs when a simple majority isn't enough to pass laws? And what does this mean for democratic accountability? Next time on Civic Currents, we'll explore how the filibuster has been used and abused in some of America's most consequential legislative battles. From civil rights to gun control, the filibuster has shaped our history. Thank you for listening. Welcome back to Filibuster Power, Politics, and Procedure. I'm Caleb.
And I'm Seth. Today we're digging into the real world impact of the filibuster, not just how it works, but what it stops. And let's be honest, that list is long.
The filibuster has left its mark on nearly every major policy debate: civil rights, gun reform, climate policy, immigration, you name it. If it's controversial, chances are the filibuster's been involved.
Let's start with one of the most dramatic examples. In 1964, Southern senators filibustered the Civil Rights Act for a stunning 60 days straight.
That's right, 60 days of non-stop obstruction. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was designed to ban segregation in public places and outlaw employment discrimination. It had strong support across the country, but in the Senate, it ran into a wall.
The Southern Bloc, led by senators like Strom, Thurmond, and Beard, used the filibuster to grind the chamber to a halt. They gave long speeches, some lasting over 14 hours. Not because they had more to say, but they just didn't want a vote to happen.
It took months of backroom negotiations, national pressure, and finally a vote for cloture, the rare move to end debate, to break the deadlock.
And that bill barely passed cloture, with just enough support to overcome obstruction. Without that, the Civil Rights Act might have never even become a law.
So when people say the filibuster protects the rights of the minority, that's true, but sometimes the minority is blocking the rights of millions of Americans.
Let's fast forward to a more recent example, 2013. After the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, which is pretty close to us, Congress considered a bipartisan gun background check bill.
The bill was co-sponsored by the Republican Pat Toomey and Democrat Joe Manchin. It wasn't radical, it simply required background checks for commercial gun sales, something polls showed 90% of Americans supported, including gun owners.
The bill got 54 votes, a clear majority, but under the filibuster, that wasn't enough. You needed 60 to move forward.
Think about that. A majority of senators, representing a majority of Americans, said yes, but the bill still failed because 46 senators said no and that was enough.
That moment was devastating to advocates. It sent a chilling message. Even after a national tragedy, with public outrage and bipartisan cooperation, a minority in the Senate could stop progress cold.
And it's not just gun reform. Here's a rapid fire look at other major policies that have been blocked by the filibuster or by the threat of it.
The DREAM Act, to give legal status to undocumented young immigrants, filibustered multiple times and never became law.
Climate legislation like the 2009 cap and trade bill, it had support, it passed the House, and then died in the Senate.
Voting rights protections, from the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to the Freedom Vote to Vote Act, both had majority support, both blocked in recent years.
Paid family leave, universal background checks, a minimum wage increase. The list goes on and on. These are policies with broad national support, but under Senate rules, majority rule just isn't enough.
And this led to growing public frustration. People vote for change, but then watch as popular policies get stuck in the Senate because of procedure.
Even presidents get hamstrung. President Obama, President Biden, they both face filibusters that blocked key parts of their agendas.
Critics argue that the filibuster gives a small group of senators, often from small states, outsized power. In today's Senate, 41 senators representing just 20% of the population can block legislation backed by the other 80%.
That's the math. And it raised a big question about today's democracy. Should 20% of the country have a veto over the other 80%?
Supporters of the filibuster say it protects minority rights and forces compromise, but in reality, it often protects inaction.
That's the tension. The filibuster was meant to encourage deliberation, but in practice, it's become a tool for gridlock, for killing bills without a real debate at all.
Let's imagine, just for a moment, what might have passed if the filibuster didn't exist in its current form. A path to citizenship for dreamers, stronger gun background checks, comprehensive climate legislation, national paid family leave, a living federal minimum wage, and modern voting protections.
So, all these that Seth just mentioned all had majority support in the Senate, and all of them died. Not because they lost a vote, but because they never got one.
So, what does this mean? The filibuster isn't just a quirky Senate rule, it's a deciding factor in whether major policies succeed or fail.
We'll be exploring reform efforts later in this series, but for now, just remember when people say Congress isn't doing anything, it's often the filibuster doing the stopping.
Next up, we're going back in time to the height of the civil rights movement to examine how the filibuster was used not just to block policy, but to preserve segregation.
Stay with us. You're listening to The Filibuster: Power, Politics, and Procedure. Welcome back to The Filibuster: Power, Politics, and Procedure. I'm Caleb.
And I'm Seth. And in this segment, we're exploring one of the biggest arguments for the filibuster, that it empowers the minority party.
Supporters say it gives the minority a seat at the table, a voice in legislation, even when they don't hold the gavel.
But critics, they say it's more than just a voice, it's a veto, a tool that could stop progress even when a majority of Americans and their elected representatives want to move forward.
Here's how one former senator put it. In quotes, when I was in office, we used the filibuster to slow down harmful bills, but I'll admit it became a political weapon. End quote.
A political weapon. That's a powerful phrase. And that transformation from procedural tool to partisan weapon is at its core of this debate.
Let's rewind just a bit. The filibuster wasn't originally designed to empower the minority party. Remember, it wasn't even in the Constitution. It came about by accident and only later became a tool for debate.
But as partisanship deepened in the 20th century, minority parties began using it more often, not just to delay legislation, but to kill it.
Why? Because the filibuster doesn't require you to win a debate, just to refuse to end it. That alone can grind the Senate to a halt.
So let's break it down. Say the majority party has 52 senators and wants to pass a bill. Normally, that should be enough. A majority, right?
Wrong. Under current Senate rules, you need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. That's called cloture. So the minority, with just 41 senators, can block the bill completely.
They don't need to argue their case. They don't even need to stand and talk. In modern practice, they could just signal a filibuster and the bill dies unless 60 senators agree to move forward.
That means the minority doesn't need to persuade anyone. They just need to unite. And in today's polarized politics, that happens a lot.
Let's look at examples where the filibusters have been used to give the minority real power. In 2005, Democrats used it to block George W. Bush's judicial nominees. In 2013, Republicans used it to block background checks in legislation. In 2021, Republicans used it to block a commission to investigate the January 6th Capitol riot.
In each of these cases, the minority was able to control the agenda. They didn't need to win an election just to hold the line.
That's the official line. But let's not forget, both parties have flipped on the filibuster depending on whether they're in power.
Here's a pattern we've seen again and again. Whichever party is in the minority tends to defend the filibuster. The filibuster ensures stability. This is about protecting minority rights. It's a check on hasty legislation. And these are quotes from people that have been in the Senate and have heard filibuster in action.
And then the moment they're in the majority, you start hearing calls to reform or even abolish it.
It's a political whiplash, and it reveals the deeper truth. The filibuster isn't a constitutional principle. It's a tactical advantage used or discarded depending on who's holding the cards.
So, what's the cost of all this? Gridlock? Endless gridlock.
In the last 2 decades, the Senate has become one of the most paralyzed institutions in American politics.
And you don't have to be a political scientist to see it. We elect senators to pass laws, fix problems, and respond to crisis. But too often, they're stuck in procedural quicksand.
Filibusters used to be rare. Today, they're the default. Virtually every major bill now assumes a 60 vote threshold, even though only 51 votes are technically needed to pass legislation under the Constitution.
That shift from rare exception to standard procedure, has transformed how Congress functions or doesn't function.
Let's make a distinction here. Protecting minority rights is a fundamental value in a democracy, but enabling minority rule is something else entirely.
With the filibuster, 41 senators representing perhaps 20% of the population can block bills supported by the other 80%.
And in a country as large and diverse as the United States, that can have massive consequences from health care to voting rights to gun policy.
It's like I voted for change, but nothing ever seems to change. So where does that leave us? The filibuster absolutely gives the minority party power, but it comes with a price. Legislative dysfunction, public cynicism, and stalled progress.
And that raises the big question here. Is this the balance the founders wanted, or a loophole that's been weaponized?
Next, we'll explore how the filibuster has evolved into a tune of routine obstruction and what that means for the future of Senate procedure.
You're listening to The Filibuster: Power, Politics, and Procedure. We'll be right back. You're listening to The Filibuster: Power, Politics, and Procedures. I'm Caleb.
And I'm Seth. We've talked about how the filibuster gives power to the minority party, but now it's time to look at what that power has done to the Senate itself.
For most of American history, the filibuster was used sparingly. It was dramatic, rare, and frankly, exhausting. Senators had to stand, speak, and keep the floor.
But those days are over. Today, the filibuster is a default move, not a last resort. And that changed everything. The filibuster has made the Senate a graveyard for new ideas.
A graveyard, not a chamber of debate, not a proving ground of policy, just a place where ideas go to die.
And that's not rhetoric. Take a look at how few bills are passed these days, or how much of Congress's energy goes towards procedural maneuvering instead of actual governing.
Senate traditions, committee debate, and yes, trust have eroded. Lawmakers assume the worst from their opponents and often deliver on that assumption.
And the filibuster, once a symbol of minority protection, has become a symbol of dysfunction. When everything needs 60 votes, you stop negotiating in good faith. You just try to block or wait it out.
The Senate was once known as the world's great deliberative body. Now, it's better known for stalemates and shutdowns.
And as one party grows more comfortable blocking legislation, the other grows more determined to rewrite the rules.
Which brings us to the heart of today's gridlock. What happens when process overwhelms purpose? When the goal stops being governance and becomes obstruction?
We see that play out not just in Washington, but in people's lives.
We spoke with Dr. Lalia Richmond, a policy expert from the University of Chicago, about what all this means outside the Senate walls. She said, the filibuster delays essential services. It doesn't just hurt political outcomes, it hurts real people waiting for reform.
Think about that. We often talk about the filibuster in abstract terms: procedure, precedent, power. But for someone waiting on healthcare access, or for a working family depending on housing relief, delay doesn't feel like politics, it feels like straight pain.
Let's go deeper. Here are just a few examples. Voting rights legislation, like the Freedom to Vote Act, was blocked despite wide public support. Minimum wage increases stuck. Climate change proposals stalled. And gun safety laws blocked again and again.
We can't afford insulin. My ballot was rejected. There's no clean water in our town. Why does nothing change? This is where the rubber meets the road. Filibusters may happen in the halls of power, but the fallout is felt in every zip code in America.
Policy is personal, and procedural delay, especially when it becomes standard, hurts people waiting for relief, justice, and progress.
So, we've seen the evolution of the filibuster from a quirk of procedure to a powerful political weapon.
We've traced its role in blocking major legislation, empowering the minority, eroding Senate norms, and shaping the everyday lives of Americans.
But one big question remains: should it stay?
Or should it go?
In our final episode, we'll look ahead. We'll talk reform, abolition, and the fierce debate over the future of the filibuster.
Is it a necessary safeguard or a relic that's breaking democracy from the inside? End the filibuster now. We need to preserve Senate tradition. Democracy doesn't work if nothing can get done. It's time for change.
The stakes, it couldn't be higher. The debate, it's only just beginning.
That's next time on The Filibuster: Power, Politics, and Procedure.
See you next time. Alright, guys, welcome back. This is the final episode in our three-part series on the filibuster. I'm Seth Becker, and I'm joined once again by Caleb.
Hey everyone, this has been a deep dive, and today we're tackling the big question: what do we do with the filibuster moving forward? Reform it, scrap it, keep it as is?
Right, and that's not hypothetical anymore. There's a real conversation happening right now in the Senate and across the country about whether the filibuster still serves a useful purpose in American democracy.
Let's start with the reform arguments. I think that one that gets the most attention is the idea of bringing back the talking filibuster. Instead of just blocking a bill with a silent objection, senators would have to stand up and hold the floor in person. No more ducking behind procedure.
It's all about accountability. Like, if you're going to stop a legislation from moving forward, you should have to do it publicly and visibly. That's what some reformers are arguing. Not to eliminate the filibuster entirely, but to restore the effort it used to require.
Yeah, and that effort used to mean standing and speaking for hours, sometimes days. It wasn't just about delay, it was about trying to sway opinion or draw attention to a certain cause. And over time, though the filibuster has turned into something more passive, you don't even have to show up on the Senate floor anymore to hold things up.
And that shift really happened after the 1970s. Like, with the adoption of the two-track system. So that's what allowed the Senate to move on to other businesses even while the filibuster was technically underway. It made obstruction easier and lowered the political cost of using it.
Which is what reforms want to reserve. They want to make it harder to filibuster, not to punish senators, but to force them to justify their actions. The theory is that if you had to actually speak and hold the floor, you'd be more selective about when you used it.
That kind of reform doesn't get rid of minority power, but it changes the balance. It asks senators to pay a political price for obstruction legislation, and in doing so, it can reduce some of the casual or strategic filibusters that clog the Senate today.
There are other reform proposals too. Some people say we should show lower the threshold for cloture, the vote to end a filibuster. Right now, it takes 60 votes, but what if it only took 55?
That would still be a supermajority, and in today's polarized Senate, even 55 votes can be a heavy lift. But reducing the number could prevent a small group, sometimes representing a tiny fraction of the country, from blocking widely supported bills.
The flip side, of course, is the slippery slope argument. If you lower the threshold to 55, what's to stop a future majority from lowering it again to 50? And at that point, you've effectively eliminated the filibuster entirely.
That's the tension at the heart of this debate. Reformers want to make the Senate more functional, but opponents of reform argue that the filibuster is one of the only tools left that forces the majority to compromise.
Let's talk about that because there's a whole other camp, maybe just as vocal, that wants to keep the filibuster exactly as it is. I mean, they say it protects minority rights, promotes deliberation, and prevents rapid swings in federal policy.
And there's truth to that. Without the filibuster, whichever party holds the Senate could pass sweeping legislation every time they have a majority, and then have that legislation reversed as soon as power shifts.
That kind of whiplash is destabilizing. Think about majority policy areas: healthcare, taxes, environmental law. If those laws can be rewritten every 2 to 4 years, it's hard for citizens and businesses to plan for the future.
Supporters of the filibuster say it forces parties to work together, that it slows things down, and slowing down is part of the Senate's design. The House is supposed to be fast and responsive. The Senate, in contrast, was meant to be cautious and deliberative.
And to some extent, that does work when both sides are willing to come to the table. But critics say the filibuster has become more about blocking than bargaining. That's that it's not encouraging cooperation so much as paralyzing the process.
So the question becomes, is the filibuster broken because of the rule itself or because of how it's being used?
Yeah, and I mean that's the big question here. Some people argue that the filibuster isn't the problem. The real issue is polarization. If senators are unwilling to compromise, then no amount of rule changes will help.
But others push back. They say the rules shape behavior. If you give politicians a powerful tool like the modern filibuster, they're going to use it and possibly abuse it. But the incentives are there.
So then we land in this in between space. Some say reform, but don't eliminate. Others say tweak the rules more precisely, like keeping the 60 vote rule but requiring physical presence to maintain a filibuster.
There's also a talk about carving out exceptions. You keep the filibuster in place for most legislation, but make exemptions for certain kinds of bills, like voting rights, the budget, or emergency spending.
But that raises another question. Where do you draw the line? Once you start carving out exceptions, is that just the beginning of the end?
Possibly, and yet the Senate has already made exceptions. In 2013, they removed the filibuster for most presidential nominations. In 2017, they did the same for Supreme Court picks. So the precedent is there.
And the result of those? Faster confirmations, but also more partisan opponents. So there's always a trade off, it seems. Reform might get things moving, but it might also make the system even more divided.
Another angle we haven't touched on is public opinion. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a Senate issue, it's a democratic issue. The public's trust in the government is affected by whether or not things actually get done.
Most Americans don't follow procedural rules like the filibuster either. They just see the outcome. Laws don't pass, problems don't get solved, and over time, that erodes faith in the system.
Some argue that reform could help restore that faith, make the Senate more transparent, more responsive. If people saw their representatives actually debating, working, compromising, maybe that would improve civic trust.
Others would worry it could have the opposite effect, that without the filibuster, the majority party would ram through legislation unchecked, and that would alienate the other half of the country.
Which brings us to the core dilemma. Reform can make government more efficient, but it could also make it more volatile.
So, where does that leave us? Is the filibuster a necessary check on power, or is it an outdated barrier to progress?
There's no simple answer. The filibuster, like so many parts of our system, wasn't created all at once. It evolved over time. And maybe now it's the time for it to evolve again.
Whatever happens next, it's not just up to senators, it's up to voters. Because the rules of democracy aren't set in stone, they're shaped by how we choose to govern ourselves. Exactly. And that raises the bigger question: how aware are most Americans of the filibuster and its role in the legislative process? It's one thing to argue about it on cable news, but it's another for everyday people to understand how it actually affects their lives.
That's a major gap. I think most people care about outcomes. They want better schools, healthcare, climate policy, job security. But what they don't always see is how Senate procedure becomes the roadblock. And let's be honest, procedural gridlock isn't something that actually goes viral on TikToks.
Not unless someone faints while holding the floor during a 19-hour talking filibuster. But really, this disconnect creates a kind of democratic fatigue. People feel like their votes don't matter because nothing changes, and they don't always know why.
And ironically, that makes the filibuster more durable. Because the voters aren't mobilized around it, there's no political cost for senators who abuse it or refuse to reform it.
Let's play this out. Say the filibuster stays exactly as it is, 60 votes required to end a debate on almost everything. But what kind of legislative world does that create in the long term?
Well, if you're looking at a government where big change is nearly impossible without one party holding a supermajority, that's rare. So either nothing gets done or legislation is watered down so much to appease the minority that it becomes meaningless.
Incrementalism becomes the ceiling. You can't swing for the fences anymore. You bunt and hope for a base hit.
But here's the paradox: even with that structure, we're still getting whiplash. Executive orders flip back and forth with each administration. Court appointments are rushed through. It's like the filibus- it's like the filibuster is supposed to stabilize the system, but it's not really working that way anymore.
That might be because it's only stabilizing part of the process. It slows down legislation, sure, but it doesn't stop presidents from acting unartfully, unilaterally. So the system just shifts pressure to the executive branch.
And that concentrates powers in ways the framers didn't intend. They didn't envision presidents using executive orders to bypass Congress entirely, but when Congress is paralyzed, the White House becomes the only game in town.
And the courts follow. With a gridlock Senate, judicial confirmations become the new battlefield. That's why the filibuster elimination for Supreme Court nominees in 2017 felt like such a seismic shift.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago. It shows how quickly norms can collapse once the pressure gets high enough.
That brings us to the danger of the asymmetric warfare. If one party decides to play hardball, abolish the filibuster, pack the courts, jam legislation through, it sets a precedent. And when the other side takes power, they retaliate. It spirals.
Escalation becomes the norm. That's the fear, right? That if we get rid of the filibuster entirely, we'll just see pendulum swings that leave the country exhausted and polarized.
But isn't that already happening? Even with the filibuster, we've seen major swings, just slower. So maybe the real issue isn't the rule, but the lack of conscience on the ends.
Like, that's deep, but maybe the filibuster is just a mirror. It reflects the deeper divides in our democracy. And getting rid of it won't fix that, but neither will keeping it.
Okay, but here's a thought. What if we made the filibuster harder to use, but not impossible? Like, you can still block a bill, but you have to pay a political price.
Yeah, like a return to the talking filibuster. Force senators to hold the floor and explain themselves in real time. No more silent objections. No more passive gridlock.
And that would make obstruction visible, which might shift public opinion depending on what's being blocked. If you're filibustering a civil rights bill, for example, you'd have to own that on C SPAN.
It would at least create accountability. And it might discourage some of the more frivolous or performative objections we've seen.
But then there's the practical problem. Senate leadership doesn't want to waste time on endless speeches. They've got full calendars.
True, but maybe the trade off is worth it. A slower process with more transparency versus a fast one buried in procedure.
Or here's another model. What if the vote threshold dropped over time? Start at 60, then go to 58, then 55, and so on. That way, debate is preserved, but eventually, there's a path to a final vote.
That's been floated before, but sometimes it's called a sliding scale filibuster. It preserves minority input but provides indefinite obstruction.
It's a compromise. I mean, like most compromises, it probably satisfies no one completely, but it keeps the train moving.
That might be where we land eventually. Not total abolition, not total preservation, but reform that adjusts the balance of power.
And balance there is really the key word. Democracy doesn't work if power is too concentrated or if it's paralyzed by veto points at every turn.
We've spent this whole episode exploring the future of filibusters, but maybe what we're really asking is what kind of democracy do we want to live in?
We want that one that rewards deliberation or one that follows action. Do we want friction or fluidity?
Those aren't just procedural questions, they're philosophical ones. They go into the heart of our political identity.
And that's why this debate isn't going away. Just because no matter what happens to the filibuster, the struggle between majority rule and minority rights will always be part of our system.
So maybe the real challenge isn't to win the debate, but to keep it honest. To make sure that whatever rules we live by, they reflect our values and our commitments.
And to make sure those rules are serving the people, not the politicians. It can empower voices or it can silence them. It can preserve stability or it can block progress.
What it becomes next, that's on all of us.
Right. And I think we have to sit with that responsibility for a minute. We're not just talking about a Senate rule here. We're talking about the shape of governance for the next generation. The filibuster may seem like a technicality, but in practice, it defines the boundaries of political imagination.
It's a ceiling and a floor at the same time. It tells us how high we could dream and how low we could fall when we can't act. And let's be honest, most people aren't thinking about Senate Rule 22 when they lose. Healthcare coverage or their roads don't get fixed, but they're living with the consequences.
Exactly. You don't have to know the term cloture motion to feel the impact of a blocked voting rights bill, or a stalled gun safety law, or the fact that Congress still can't pass comprehensive climate legislation even when the science is screaming at us.
And this is where it gets real. The filibuster isn't neutral. It has a pattern. Over the past few decades, it's been used most often to block progressive legislation, civil rights, labor protections, environmental standards, not because the ideas weren't popular, but because they didn't have 60 votes in a deeply divided chamber.
You know, the classic defense of the filibuster is that it protects the minority. But we need to ask which minority? Is it the political minority in the Senate or the ideological minority in the country? Because those aren't always the same thing.
Let's say you have a Senate where 41 senators represent only 20% of the US population. That minority can block everything. That's not protecting the vulnerable voices. That's letting a sliver of the country hold the rest hostage.
It's minority rule dressed up as democratic caution, and we've seen what that does. It leads to paralysis, frustration, and sometimes even extremism. Because when people feel like change through the system is impossible, they start looking outside the system.
Which feeds distrust. And that distrust doesn't stay in the Senate chamber, it filters down to every level of political life: school boards, city councils, courts, elections. Suddenly, the whole project feels broken.
And that brings us to the global picture. Let's zoom out for a second. How do other democracies handle this balance between majority rule and minority rights?
Great question. Most parliamentary democracies don't have a filibuster at all. Take the UK. If the majority party wins an election, it can pass its legislative agenda. That's the deal. You win power, you get to govern. If voters don't like it, they throw you out next time.
Same in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. There's debate, there's procedure, but there's no built in mechanism to grind everything to a halt indefinitely.
The US is an outlier in a lot of ways. We already have tons of checks and balances, two chambers of Congress, the veto, the courts. Adding a 60 vote rule on top of all of that, it's like instilling a traffic light on an already jammed road.
And it begs the question, do we trust majorities enough to govern, or are we so afraid of bad outcomes that we'd rather have no outcomes at all?
Because here's the thing, if a party pushes bad policy, they can be voted out. But if no policy ever gets passed, no one is accountable. Gridlock becomes the status quo, and you can't vote out a status quo.
We start to mistake inaction for stability, but in a changing world, refusing to act is a decision. It has consequences.
Like on climate, our reproductive rights, or AI regulation, or cybersecurity. The world doesn't slow down just because our Senate does.
You want a chilling stat? In the 2020s, we've had more major climate reports than major climate bills. Why? Because even when there's public support, the filibuster demands supermajorities that just don't exist anymore.
And let's talk about public support for a second. Because polling consistently shows that a majority of Americans favor background checks on guns, support abortion access, want action on climate change, and yet legislation stalls. That disconnect fuels cynicism.
People wonder, what's the point? And when that question takes hold, democracy erodes, not with a bang, but with a shrug.
So maybe the question isn't should we reform the filibuster, but must we?
To preserve democracy, ironically, we might need to change the very things that were meant to protect it, including this rule.
And let's say we did reform it. Let's say tomorrow the Senate adopted a talking filibuster only, or a sliding scale threshold, or a carve out for democracy related legislation. What would change?
Maybe not everything, maybe not right away, but we'd move from a politics of impossibility to a politics of responsibility. Senators couldn't hide behind we don't have 60 votes anymore.
They'd have to actually make choices and own them. Accountability, that's the hidden power of reform. It puts the spotlight back on action, not procedure.
And honestly, that's what this whole debate is really about. Are we willing to update the rules of the game so that they serve the people, not just the players?
Because if democracy is supposed to be dynamic, then its rules can't be sacred relics. They need to evolve within the times.
And we're in one of those times right now. Polarization, climate crisis, technology upheaval. We need a government that can respond, not just reflect.
So here's the final word I'd offer: urgency. Not panic, not haste, but urgency. A sense that the stakes are too high to accept businesses as usual.
I'd offer hope, because even in gridlock, change is possible, reform is possible, renewal is possible, but only if we push for it.
That push doesn't start in a Senate hearing. It starts in classrooms, conversations, ballots, and podcasts like this.
And it's not just about policy, it's about culture, political culture. A society where people expect democracy to work and where they're willing to defend it when it doesn't.
Right, because the filibuster debate isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a much bigger question. What kind of democracy do we actually want to be?
One that's functional, inclusive, nimble, accountable, or one that keeps tripping over its own rules.
And there's no shame in revising those rules. We've done it before. The Senate didn't even have cloture until 1917. Unanimous consent wasn't always a thing. The filibuster itself has changed many times, and it can again.
That's actually a sign of health in a democracy, not weakness. adapting when the needs of the people change.
If you went back in time and told the framers that the senators in the 21st century would be reading Dr. Seuss on the floor to block a healthcare bill, I think they'd be baffled. They designed a republic, not a theater.
And yet, here we are. And maybe that's the most important reason to talk about this. Because if we don't engage with how our institutions are being used or misused, we risk letting dysfunction become tradition.
That's power. Dysfunction becoming tradition. I think we've already started to see that. People shrug off stalemates. Gridlock's expected. The big bills that do not pass are often rushed omnibus packages filled with carve outs, compromises, and backroom deals.
It's like the system only moves when there's a crisis. Budget cliffs, debt ceilings, government showdowns. That's not sustainable governance. That's governing by alarm clock.
And the filibuster enables that cycle. It makes regular order impossible. It makes deliberation performative. It turns every vote into a hostage negotiation.
So, what's the alternative? What would a post filibuster Senate actually look like?
Maybe at first it would feel chaotic. More bills flying through, more votes happening. But over time, you get clarity, accountability. If a party holds power and passes bad laws, they answer for that. If they govern well, they get rewarded.
And the minority still has tools: public pressure, floor speeches, amendments, negotiation, just not a permanent veto.
Because that's what the filibuster has become, a veto without responsibility, a way to say no without ever having to say why.
But democracy asks more from us. It asks us to show up, to take sides, to take risks, and yes, to lose sometimes.
You can't have meaningful wins without meaningful losses. And when you remove the possibility of either, you get stagnation. Politics without stakes.
Which is why people disengage, why turnout lags, why cynicism grows. When nothing seems to change, why even bother?
But here's the twist, the filibuster can change. It already has several times, and every time it was because the pressure got loud enough.
In 2013, Democrats changed it for more presidential appointments. And in 2017, Republicans did the same for Supreme Court nominees. The sky didn't fall, but the myth that the filibuster is sacred, that took a hit.
And those changes weren't spontaneous. They're a result of years of pressure, organizing, frustration, and finally action. Same kind of push is what it'll take again.
Not just from lawmakers, but from us, constituents, advocates, educators, voters. If we believe the rules are broken, it's on us to demand new ones.
And that doesn't mean blindly following party lines. It means asking hard questions, pushing for reforms that strengthen democracy for everyone, not just the side you're on today.
Because the tables turn, majorities flip, and whatever rules we set now, we'll have to live with.
So let's make sure there are rules that promote action, not inertia. Rules that reward courage, not obstruction.
And let's remember that democracy isn't automatic. It's not a self driving car. It needs the steering, it needs the attention.
And sometimes it needs repair.
This conversation that we're having right now about the filibuster, about democratic norms, it's part of that repair process.
So, like whether you're a student, a teacher, a voter, a candidate, This is your invitation, not just to learn, but to participate.
Because democracy is something we build together or we watch decay alone.
Let's choose to build. Let's choose to act. Let's choose to care.
And if the Senate won't lead, let the people lead them.
Because the filibuster may belong to the Senate, but the future belongs to all of us. That's going to do it for this episode and for our series on the filibuster.
3 episodes, one big question. How do we want democracy to work? Not just for one party or one moment, but for all of us, for the long haul.
We've gone from its obscure origins to its controversial role today. And now it's the question of where it's headed, or maybe more accurately, where we're going to take it.
And I'd have to say, if there's one takeaway, it's this. The filibuster isn't the heart of democracy. People are. Institutions matter, but they reflect the will and the choices of those who engage with them.
So keep asking questions, keep pushing your reps, stay engaged. Don't let the process become an excuse for silence.
And if you're made it this far with us, thank you. Seriously, these conversations aren't easy, but they are necessary.
You can revisit all 3 episodes of this series wherever you listen to podcasts. And if it sparks ideas, debate, or even frustration, talk about it. That's where change starts.
We're Seth and Caleb, and this has been The Filibuster Power, Politics, and Procedure.
See you next time on Civic Currents.